My breath hitched, a sudden painful gasp trapped in my chest. The china tray laden with tea and biscuits slipped from my numb fingers. It felt like an eternity as it fell, then shattered against the polished hallway floor, the crash echoing the explosion in my own head. Through the ringing in my ears, I could still hear my mother's voice, sharp and cold, slicing through the quiet of the living room. She was saying it was the only way. That I would have to take responsibility for the missing funds. Michael, her precious Michael, just couldn't have this on his record. My own parents, my own mother, plotting to throw me, their daughter Sarah, under the bus. The words were like acid, burning through years of carefully constructed hope, years of trying to earn their love. I stood frozen, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, the scent of spilled tea suddenly cloying and unbearable. They jumped at the sound of the crash, their heads snapping towards me. In that split second, before their expressions could morph into feigned concern, I saw it. The raw guilt. The chilling calculation. And in that moment something inside me fractured, broke clean in two. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a declaration of war. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, they would not get away with it. Before my world imploded on a wave of deceit and shattered porcelain, life had a certain rhythm. As a young woman just starting to carve out my own path, I split my time between a part-time job at a cozy local bookstore, my little sanctuary of words and calm, and online courses in graphic design. My biggest dream was to work for myself, creating, designing, all from a small apartment I was saving every spare penny for. I even had a special account jokingly named my escape fund. Little did I know how desperately I'd need an escape, and not just from the familiar confines of home. Our family lived in a comfortable, if slightly old-fashioned two-story house in a leafy suburb. My bedroom was my haven, a colorful mess of art supplies, half-finished sketches, and towering stacks of books. It was my retreat from the subtle, ever-present hum of tension that often filled the other rooms. A tension that, more often than not, revolved around Michael, my younger brother. Michael, well, he was Michael. 2 years my junior, he possessed a charm that could coax birds from trees and, apparently, absolve him of any wrongdoing in our parents' eyes. He was their golden boy, their miracle. While I was the responsible one, the studious one, the one expected to manage, Michael was coddled. His mistakes were smoothed over, his smallest achievements lauded. If I aced an exam, it was a quiet, "That's nice, dear." If Michael scraped a pass, it was practically a ticker-tape parade. I did love my brother, or at least I told myself I did. It was difficult, though, when he seemed to exist in a consequence-free bubble, often at my expense. He'd borrow things and forget to return them, or return them damaged. He'd conveniently leave his wallet at home when we were out. Small grievances, perhaps, but they accumulated like a slow poison into a resentment I tried to ignore. My parents would just sigh. "That's just Michael," they'd say. Or worse, "Can't you help him out, Sarah? He's still finding his way." He was perpetually finding his way, usually through my patience or the contents of my escape fund, which suffered frequent unexplained withdrawals for his so-called emergencies. Despite it all, I clung to the notion of family. I yearned for their approval, for them to see me, really see me, not just as Michael's sensible, reliable older sister. It's a craving that now fills me with a bitter shame. I reasoned that their blatant favoritism was just their way. I tried to be less demanding, less visible, hoping that if I caused no trouble, I'd earn their affection. It was a quiet, desperate kind of hope, the kind that only thrives in shadows, easily extinguished by the harsh light of reality. A reality that was, even then, gathering like a storm on the horizon. The first real tremor that unsettled the fragile peace of our home arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday. I'd just received a small bonus from the bookstore. I was happily mentally allocating it towards a new drawing tablet I'd been eyeing. I walked into the kitchen to find my mother on the phone, her voice low and strained. She was asking someone named Mr. Henderson if he was absolutely sure that there must be some mistake. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the old-fashioned landline. She hung up, her face visibly pale, and then she saw me. "Oh, Sarah," she said, trying for a casual tone that didn't quite land. "It's nothing really. Just a small misunderstanding down at Michael's work." Michael had recently started as a junior assistant at Henderson Accounting, a local firm. My parents had been insufferably proud, calling it his first step towards a serious career. A misunderstanding? What kind? I asked, a familiar tightness coiling in my gut. Just some figures that aren't quite adding up, she replied, a little too quickly. Michael thinks it's probably a system glitch. He's so good with computers, you know. That was their standard line. Michael was always good with whatever the situation required him to be good with to excuse his latest blunder. Later that evening, my father came home looking unusually grim. He and my mother shut themselves in their study for nearly an hour. I could hear the low, anxious murmur of their voices, punctuated by my father's frustrated sighs. When they finally emerged, they both looked exhausted. Michael, when he eventually sauntered in long after dinner should have been cleared, was uncharacteristically quiet and sullen. He avoided looking at me and just picked at his food, offering only mumbled one-word answers to their gentle, worried questions. A few days later, my mother approached me, her smile looking stretched and unnatural. "Sir, dear," she began, "Michael's had a bit of a setback at work. There was a small issue and he needs a little help to tide him over until his next paycheck. Just a few hundred. You know he's good for it." My escape fund, the one for the drawing tablet, flashed in my mind. A few hundred? I thought you said it was a system glitch? Her eyes flickered away for a second. Well, it turned out to be a little more complicated than he initially thought. These things can happen. He just needs a little support from his family. We're family after all. The unspoken pressure was enormous. If I refused, I'd be the cold, unfeeling sister. Reluctantly, I agreed. The wave of relief that washed over her face was almost alarming. It felt too profound for just a few $100s. A tiny, cold seed of real unease began to sprout within me. What exactly was Michael tiding over? And why did my parents suddenly look like they were carrying a secret, terrible burden, one that only Michael seemed to be at the center of? That supposed small issue at Michael's work quickly proved to be anything but small. The few $100s I'd lent him, or more accurately given him because I had no illusions about ever seeing it again, was clearly just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in our house grew increasingly oppressive. My parents started having more frequent, hushed and frantic phone calls, often late at night or early in the morning. They'd fall silent the moment I walked into a room. Michael himself became more erratic. Sometimes he was withdrawn and sullen, other times almost jumpy, as if he were constantly expecting bad news. One Saturday, while I was tidying the living room, I found a crumpled envelope shoved deep between the sofa cushions. My fingers brushed against official-looking paper. It was a letter from Henderson Accounting addressed to Michael. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I carefully unfolded it. This was no letter about a simple system glitch. It was a formal warning. It mentioned significant discrepancies in the petty cash account. It detailed unauthorized withdrawals. The sum mentioned wasn't a few $100s. It was several thousand. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a setback. This was theft. This could mean serious legal trouble. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I waited until that evening, then confronted my parents, the letter trembling in my hand. "What is this?" I demanded. "You told me it was just a misunderstanding." My father let out a heavy sigh, running a hand distractedly through his already messy hair. "Sarah, it's complicated," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Michael made a mistake. A very foolish mistake, yes, but he didn't mean any real harm by it." "A mistake? Dad, this letter uses terms like unauthorized withdrawals. That's stealing." The word hung in the air between us, stark and ugly. My mother immediately rushed to Michael's defense, her voice sharp. "Don't use that word, Sarah. He was under a lot of pressure. He fully intended to pay it all back. He got in a little over his head." Her eyes pleaded with me. "Mr. Henderson is willing to be lenient," she added, "if the money is returned. Quickly. And quietly." "And how exactly is Michael going to return several $1,000s?" I asked, a cold dread already forming as I anticipated their answer. Their eyes met, a silent, miserable exchange passing between them. Then my father turned to me, his expression a painful mix of shame and grim determination. "We're pooling our resources," he said heavily. Your mother is taking out a small loan against her retirement fund. I'm selling some of those old company shares I had." He paused, and his gaze was heavy with unspoken expectation. "And Sarah, we were hoping you could contribute. From your savings. Whatever you can spare. My escape fund. My dreams of an independent life, of my own small apartment." He was asking me to sacrifice all of it for Michael's crime. "You want me to pay for his mistake?" Disbelief warred with a rising tide of cold anger. "It's to protect your brother, Sarah," my mother said, her voice soft but insistent, almost wheedling. "It's to protect this family. Think of his future. A police record would absolutely ruin him. My future, it seemed, was expendable. The pressure was immense, the emotional blackmail suffocating. They weren't just asking for my money. They were asking for my complicity, my silence. They were asking me to enable him yet again. The vague unease I'd felt before had now solidified into a chilling certainty. They were willing to go to almost any lengths to protect Michael. I was beginning to realize just how far those lengths might extend, and who would inevitably be crushed in the process. A subtle shift occurred within me then, a hardening I hadn't known I was capable of. This was no longer just about money. It was about something far more fundamental. The Henderson accounting debacle was eventually resolved, or at least that's what they told me. My parents looked visibly relieved, albeit noticeably poorer. Michael, true to form, acted as if a great burden had been lifted, quickly reverting to his usual carefree, entitled self. The scare, it seemed, was already forgotten by him. I, however, could not forget. I had contributed a significant portion of my hard-earned savings, a sacrifice that left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth every time I allowed myself to think about my now-delayed dreams. The bedrock of trust I'd once had in my parents had been severely eroded, replaced by a wary, watchful suspicion. But the real storm, the one that would tear our family apart, was still gathering. It broke a few months later, beginning with a frantic phone call in the dead of night. I was jolted awake by my mother's panicked cry from downstairs. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the landing. I saw her there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light, the phone pressed tightly to her ear, her face a mask of terror. "Oh my God. Michael," she choked out. Is he okay?" My father was already halfway down the stairs, his movements urgent. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest, a terrible premonition gripping me. It turned out Michael had been at a party. There had been an incident. A hit and run. Someone was seriously injured, lying in a hospital bed. And Michael's car, a sporty little coupe they'd proudly bought him for his 21st birthday, matched the description of the vehicle that had sped away from the scene. The police were on their way to our house to talk to him. The next few hours were a nightmarish blur of hushed, frantic whispers, pale, strained faces, and the sickly, pervasive smell of fear. Michael, when he finally crept home just minutes before the police arrived, was an absolute wreck. He was rambling, almost incoherent, vehemently denying everything one moment and looking utterly, pitifully terrified the next. He claimed his car had been stolen from the party, that he knew nothing about any accident. But his eyes darted around the room like those of a trapped animal. He reeked of cheap alcohol and panic. The police officers who arrived were polite but firm. They questioned Michael at length. They examined his car, which he claimed had mysteriously reappeared a few blocks from the party venue. It had a fresh, deep scratch along the passenger side, a scratch Michael couldn't explain. He insisted he'd left the car locked. There were no visible signs of forced entry. His story was flimsy, riddled with gaping holes and inconsistencies. After the police left, stating they would be in touch, the true horror began to unfold. This horror didn't come from the law, but from within the supposed sanctuary of my own family. My parents immediately went into crisis mode. Their singular, unwavering focus was to protect Michael no matter the cost. Logic, reason, even basic morality seemed to have been jettisoned. Over the following days, I watched, sickened, as they meticulously constructed a fortress of lies around him. They coached Michael, rehearsed his alibi over and over. Then they started talking about my car, an older, sensible sedan. They mused aloud how Michael often borrowed it because it was less conspicuous than his flashy coupe. They began to drop insidious hints that perhaps I had been out late that fateful night. These suggestions were subtle at first. "Sarah, dear, you were working late at the bookstore that night, weren't you?" My mother would ask, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "What time did you get in?" I hadn't been working. I had been home reading a book. The insinuation was monstrous. I confronted them, my voice shaking with disbelief and outrage. "What are you implying? You know Michael was at that party. You know it was his car involved." My father had the grace to look away, unable to meet my eyes. "We're just trying to understand all the possibilities, Sarah," he mumbled. "The police are looking at everyone." My mother, however, was far more direct, her gaze chillingly steady. "Michael's life will be ruined if he's charged with this, Sarah," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "He's sensitive. He wouldn't survive prison. You're strong. You could handle his scrutiny." "Scrutiny? You mean you want them to suspect me?" I was aghast. The sheer, cold-blooded audacity of it, their willingness to sacrifice me to save him, was breathtaking. I felt like I was drowning, and the hands pushing me under were the very hands that should have been pulling me to safety. It was then, in the shadows of the hallway, that I overheard their quiet, venomous conversation. The one where my mother declared that I would have to take responsibility for the missing funds, just before the tea tray crashed. Funds? It wasn't about funds anymore. It was about a hit and run. They were escalating their plans to protect him, and I was their designated scapegoat. The betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was a chasm, and I was teetering on the edge, staring into an abyss of their making. The shattering of the tea tray was the overture to the complete demolition of my world. As my parents stared at me from the living room doorway, their faces a clumsy ballet of shock and hastily concealed guilt, something cold and hard coalesced within me. The pain of their betrayal was a physical ache, a gaping wound in my chest. But beneath that agony, a steely resolve began to form. They would not do this. They would not sacrifice my life, my future, to shield Michael from the consequences of his reckless, criminal actions. In the days that followed, I moved through our house like a phantom, my grief and rage a constant, silent companions. They attempted to speak to me, to smooth things over with empty platitudes and pathetic pleas for my understanding. My mother would say, "Sarah, we only want what's best for this family," her eyes welling with crocodile tears. My father would try a more reasoned, paternal tone, saying, "It's a terrible situation, Sarah, but Michael's future is so fragile." Their words were hollow, meaningless. This family, their precious family, clearly didn't include me if my destruction was considered its best option. I knew I couldn't fight them with raw emotion. They were too deeply entrenched in their self-serving delusion, too desperate to protect their golden boy. I needed evidence. Cold, hard, irrefutable proof of Michael's guilt and, more importantly, their conspiracy to frame me. So I began to watch. To listen. I became a silent archivist of their deceit, every sense hyper-alert. My first significant breakthrough came, ironically, from Michael himself. His arrogance was his undoing. He was constantly on a private messaging app, exchanging texts with his friend Tom, the same Tom who was supposed to be part of his flimsy alibi for the night of the hit and run. Michael was always glued to his phone, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips when he thought no one was looking. One evening, he carelessly left his laptop open in his room for a few minutes while he went downstairs for a snack. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and anticipation, but I forced myself to slip into his room. His message window with Tom was still active on the screen. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just casual chatter. Michael was bragging. "Dude, they totally bought the stolen car story," or one message read. Tom's reply was more cautious. "You're crazy, man. What if they find out the truth?" Michael's chilling response. "Nah, Mom and Dad are sorting it. They think Sarah might take the heat. She's always been the responsible one." Perfect cover. He'd even punctuated it with a winking face symbol. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I quickly, silently, took photographs of the screen with my phone. Each soft click of the camera shutter felt like another nail being hammered into their carefully constructed lies. But I needed more. I needed to catch my parents in their own words. I remembered an old digital voice recorder I still had from my college journalism course, tucked away in a desk drawer. The battery thankfully was still good. The next evening, knowing they always held their hushed strategy sessions in the study after dinner, I managed to covertly slip the small device under a stack of old newspapers on a side table. I pressed the record button just before I was predictably called away to attend to some mundane chore. My nerves were stretched taut, every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, amplified in the charged silence. Waiting for them to finish their plotting felt like an agonizing eternity. When I finally retrieved the recorder, my palms were slick with sweat. I retreated to my room, locked the door, and plugged in my headphones, my heart pounding. What I heard confirmed my worst fears, yet simultaneously ignited a grim sense of satisfaction. It was all there. My mother's voice, chillingly calm, outlining how they would subtly suggest to the police that I had easy access to Michael's car keys, how I'd been acting strangely lately, how I seemed stressed and secretive. My father, his voice laced with reluctance but ultimate agreement, discussing how they could guide my testimony if the police questioned me. They even talked about how they would help me find a good lawyer once I was implicated, as if this were some perverse act of parental kindness. They were meticulously, callously planning my complete and utter ruin. The twist wasn't just that I now had proof of Michael's direct guilt. It was that I had undeniable, damning proof of their calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy to sacrifice me on the altar of his protection. The power dynamic in our fractured family had just undergone a seismic shift. They believed they were in control. They had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. The following Sunday, my Aunt Carol and Uncle Joe were due for their regular monthly family dinner. Aunt Carol was my mother's sister and Uncle Joe her husband. They were, generally speaking, decent people, though often blissfully oblivious to the true toxic dynamics that simmered beneath the surface of our household. They were always quick to praise Michael's supposed newfound maturity and my parents' supposedly wonderful job in raising him. They would be the perfect audience for the drama I was about to orchestrate. My parents always put on their most flawless, happy, supportive family facade for them. This time that facade was going to be publicly, irrevocably shattered. I spent the days leading up to that dinner in a strange state of suspended animation, a deceptive calm before the storm I knew I was about to unleash. I meticulously backed up the incriminating photos of Michael's messages and the damning audio recording of my parents to multiple cloud storage accounts and to a small USB stick I kept securely hidden. I even typed out a clear, concise timeline of events, detailing Michael's accident and my parents' subsequent plot. I felt oddly detached, as if I were observing myself preparing for the final act of a tragedy entirely of their own making. Dinner that Sunday was, as anticipated, a masterclass in familial pretense. My mother laughed a little too loudly, a little too shrilly at Uncle Joe's familiar corny jokes. My father held forth with pronouncements about current events, playing the role of the wise patriarch. Michael, clearly emboldened by his firm belief that he was safe and untouchable, was at his most charming and animated, effortlessly soaking up Aunt Carol's effusive praise. I ate quietly, a silent observer at the feast of lies, my heart a steady, determined drum against my ribs. Then, as coffee was being served, my mother, with a perfectly executed sigh of maternal concern directed at Aunt Carol, began her performance. "We've just been so terribly worried about Sarah lately," she said, her voice laced with false sympathy. "She seems so distant. And you know, the police have been asking more questions about that awful hit and run a few weeks ago. They even wondered if she might have seen something or, perhaps even been out that night." She gave a delicate, convincing shudder. That was my cue. The moment I had been waiting for. I placed my coffee cup down on its saucer with a deliberate, soft click. The small sound seemed to cut through the polite chatter, drawing everyone's attention. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly calm, surprisingly clear. "I think it's time we all had a very honest, very open conversation about what really happened that night. And about who's truly been distant and exactly why." A flicker of profound unease, quickly suppressed, crossed my mother's face. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Michael looked momentarily confused, his charming smile faltering. Aunt Carol and Uncle Joe, however, looked intrigued, sensing an undercurrent they hadn't noticed before. "Sarah, dear, perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place," my father began, his tone attempting to be placating, but with an edge of warning. "Oh, I think it's the perfect time and the perfect place," I replied smoothly, reaching for my phone which I'd placed beside my plate. "You see, Michael, you weren't quite as clever or as discreet as you thought with your messages to Tom." I turned the phone so the screen faced him, displaying his boastful, damning texts. His face, just moments before alight with smug confidence, turned a ghastly shade of white. The charming smirk vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of dawning, sickening horror. "What is this?" my mother gasped, leaning forward, her eyes wide with alarm. "This," I said, my voice gaining strength and volume, "is Michael admitting to his friend Tom that his car wasn't actually stolen that night. This is him admitting he was involved in the hit and run. And this," I added, looking directly at my parents, "is him saying that you, Mom and Dad, were sorting it by planning for me, his sister, to take the heat." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the dining table. Aunt Carol's jaw had literally dropped. Uncle Joe stared, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then to dawning anger as he looked from me to my parents. That's taken completely out of context. It's not what it looks like." Michael stammered, his voice cracking, his eyes darting desperately towards our parents for rescue. "Oh, I think it's precisely what it looks like," I continued, unperturbed. Then I calmly pulled the small digital voice recorder from my pocket. "And this is a recording of Mom and Dad from their little strategy meeting in the study last Tuesday evening. A recording of them meticulously planning how to frame me for your crime, Michael. How to subtly suggest to the police that I was the one driving your car. How to manipulate my testimony. Would anyone at this table like to hear it?" My mother let out a strangled sob, a sound of pure theatrical despair. "Sarah, how could you do this to us? How could I?" My voice rose, no longer calm, but vibrating with the cold, righteous fury I had suppressed for so long. "How could you? How could you plot to destroy your own daughter to save him, after everything he's already done? The thousands of dollars he stole from his job, which I helped pay back from my own savings. And now this. A hit and run? Someone was seriously injured because of him, because of his cowardice." My father slumped in his chair, his face ashen, his bravado completely gone. Michael was staring blankly at the tablecloth, trembling visibly. Aunt Carol was looking at my mother with an expression of unadulterated disgust. "Mark, is this true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before my parents could concoct another web of deceit, I pressed play on a short, particularly damning segment of the audio recording. My mother's voice, clear, cold, and calculating, filled the suddenly silent room, detailing her insidious plan to implicate me. The color drained completely from Aunt Carol's face. Uncle Joe just shook his head slowly, his disappointment and condemnation palpable in his gaze. "The police are already aware of the new evidence I've provided them," I stated, my gaze sweeping over my parents and my brother, pinning them with the weight of their actions. "They have copies of Michael's messages, the full audio recording of your conspiracy, and a comprehensive signed statement from me. They'll be contacting you very soon, Michael." "Mom, Dad, I believe obstruction of justice and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice are also considered very serious offenses." The payoff wasn't a loud, screaming victory. It was the devastating, crushing silence that followed my words. It was the complete and utter implosion of their carefully constructed world of lies and favoritism. It was the look of horrified, final realization on Michael's face as he understood at last that there was no escape this time. It was the burning shame etched deeply onto my parents' features as their profound betrayal was laid bare before their family. It was the dawning awareness in their eyes that their precious, coddled son was finally, truly on his own. And for me, it was the first deep, clean, liberating breath I'd taken in what felt like an eternity. The immediate aftermath was as swift and as brutal as they deserved. The police, armed with the undeniable evidence I had provided, reopened their investigation with a laser focus on Michael. Faced with the irrefutable proof from his own boastful messages and the chilling recording of our parents' conspiracy, Michael's fabricated story crumbled like dust. He was arrested and formally charged with leaving the scene of an accident causing injury, and subsequently several other related offenses. His fragile future, which my parents had been so desperate to protect, was now firmly and rightly in the hands of the justice system. My parents ultimately were not charged with conspiracy, a complex legal hurdle to prove to the fullest extent, but their world imploded in other, perhaps more fitting ways. Aunt Carol and Uncle Joe were utterly appalled by what they had heard and witnessed firsthand. News of such a profound betrayal travels with lightning speed in close-knit families and tight communities. The respect and standing they once commanded within their social circles evaporated overnight. They became subjects of hushed whispers, their story a cautionary tale of parental failure and moral bankruptcy. The pervasive shame became their constant companion, a far more enduring and personal punishment than any I could have ever devised myself. As for me, I moved out. I gathered what was left of my depleted escape fund, found a small but sunny studio apartment on the other side of town, and poured every ounce of my energy into my graphic design courses and my comforting job at the bookstore. The quiet solitude of my own space was a healing balm to my frayed nerves and wounded spirit. The physical and emotional distance from my family was, admittedly, painful in a certain way. It felt like mourning the loss of the family I thought I had, or perhaps the family I had desperately wished for. But alongside that grief, there was an incredible, soaring sense of liberation. It took a long time to fully heal. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, and rebuilding trust, especially trust in my own judgment for having been so blind for so long, is a slow and arduous process. But with each passing day, with each small step I took towards my own independent future, I felt stronger, more centered, more myself. I learned that true family isn't merely about shared blood. It's about shared respect, unwavering support, and unshakable truth. My parents and Michael had catastrophically failed on every single one of those counts. Looking back now, exposing their lies wasn't just about seeking revenge, though there was a certain grim satisfaction in that. It was, more importantly, about reclaiming my life, my truth, and my future from those who had tried to steal it. It was about drawing an indelible line in the sand and declaring unequivocally that I would not be their sacrificial lamb. There's a quiet, profound satisfaction in knowing that justice, in its own way, ultimately prevailed. Michael faced the consequences he so richly deserved, and my parents are now living with the heavy, unyielding reality of what they tried to do. I learned that sometimes the most difficult and most necessary battles are those fought against the people closest to you. But winning those battles for your own sake, for your own survival, is the greatest, most empowering victory of all. My peace was hard-won, but it is unequivocally mine. And I am, at long last, truly wonderfully free.